Greetings, fellow scribes! Welcome back to the archive. This week begins a 5-part series talking about Star Wars games. Now, this is not just going to be the RPGs. I'm going to be spending the next 5 weeks talking about various games. I'm talking about the 3 different iterations of the RPG, the West End Games version, the Wizards of the Coast versions, and the current Fantasy Flight version. I'll be talking about the first edition of the X-Wing game from Fantasy Flight, and I will be talking about the Wizards of the Coast card game. This is all just to kick off and commemorate the upcoming end of the Skywalker saga. So sit back, relax, and enjoy as we kick this off talking about the West End Games Star Wars RPG, the classic that started them all. The West End Games system is the granddaddy of all the Star Wars RPGs. In fact, for many years, it was the most events at major conventions like Gen Con, more even than whatever the current system was. This has declined over recent years, but there are still a lot of events at conventions like Gen Con for the West End Games Star Wars. But what set this apart was this was a completely skill-based system. You had your attributes. The attributes were the base level for all skills covered by that attribute. And in character creation, you would assign extra dice to the individual skills. Combat, or any skill resolution, because everything was a skill check, you would roll a number of dice equal to your skill, and you would add the total up. Now, one of these dice was a different color. This was the wild die. And what would happen when you rolled that wild die? If it rolled a 1, you would subtract the highest die you had rolled from your test. So that meant if you rolled 4 die, one of them was the wild die and that rolled a 1. And you rolled a 6, and a 2. You would subtract the 6, the first 6, from that total. Meaning you just negated the other 6. So your total was a 2. But it's a little bit more than that. You see, you had options that you could do. You could spend one of your force points. A force-sensitive character had 2. Most other characters had 1. And double your dice pool. You still had 1 die for that wild die, but the rest of your whole pool was doubled. The other option was you could spend a character point and add an extra die. Character points, by the way, were experience points. So you could spend experience points, essentially, to, on a single test, have an extra die. Which was useful. Now, one thing that they did that was sort of not really popular later on, but made sense at the time, was when your character did something bad, you gained dark side points. Now, whenever you would normally get a force point, you could atone for that dark side point. As in, instead of getting a force point, you could lose a dark side point. But whenever you got a dark side point, you rolled 1 die. If you rolled less than your actual accumulated dark side points, you fell to the dark side and ceased being a player character. The common house rule was when you got 5 dark side points, you stopped being a player character. Just outright. Most people just did it that way. At least in my experience. But another neat factor was how stuff worked with spaceships and vehicles in general. You would roll your skill, and then for a weapon, you would roll the fire control dice extra. For piloting rolls, you would roll its maneuverability rating. What this meant was that a good pilot could take even a crappy ship and make it dangerous. And believe me, I have some fond memories of good pilots doing horrible, horrible things to people with Y-wings. Now, you put a good pilot in a good ship, no one stood a chance. But that's really just how things were. You know, it's like the Y-wing had a maneuverability of 2 dice. The X-wing had a maneuverability of 3 dice. And the A-wing had a maneuverability of 4 dice. Meanwhile, the poor B-wing had a maneuverability of 1 die plus 1. But that just goes to show a good pilot could do wonders with these. Just like, you know, the fire control for the laser cannons on a B-wing, Y-wing, was 2 die. For the laser cannons on an X-wing, it was 3 die. For the fire control system on the B-wing, its weapons ranged from 1 die all the way up to 4 die. So these were flexible ships, and you can immediately see how having a good pilot in these can make a whole lot of difference. But how do you get a good pilot? Well, let's take a look at character creation and advancement to talk about that. How did character creation work? Well, character creation works sort of like this. The first thing you would do is you would pick your species. Whatever you were playing, this determines your baseline stats. So, you know, if you were playing human, you had a minimum of 2 die in every attribute and a maximum of 4 die in every attribute. You had 12 dice for an average human. You're not average. You're heroes. This means you get 6 dice beyond the starting level. So a human would have 18 dice. What this means is that you spent 12 dice to bring yourself up to your minimums down the line. And then you would spend 6 dice between dexterity, knowledge, mechanical, perception, strength, and technical. And between those skills, you'd have to work out how to spend your dice. Now, you could put a whole dice into something, or you could break that dice into what were called pips. 3 plus 1 increments. So, you could easily make a human who you assigned 3 dice to every attribute, or you could assign 4 dice to an attribute you felt really important for that character, and then break dice down into pips, assign them between dice and attributes, however you wanted to deal with it. However, not every race worked the same way. Twi'leks, for instance, had a 11 dice base attribute. What that means is they had 11 dice plus 6, so they would have 17 dice to spread among their attributes. Their minimums were dexterity 1 die, knowledge 1 die, mechanical 1 die, strength 1 die, technical 1 die, and perception 2 die. So that meant of those 17 dice, they spent 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of those reaching their minimums. So once they've reached their minimums, they would then have 10 dice to spend. Now, the maximum in dexterity, strength, and technical for a Twi'lek was 3 die. Their maximum mechanical was 2 die plus 1. Knowledge was a maximum of 4 die, and perception was 4 die plus 2. So this meant that in most areas, they were not as good as humans, and could never be as good starting off. Now, once you've assigned your attributes, you would get 7 die to spend among skills. And how skills worked was every skill starts at the level of the attribute. As soon as you put 1 pip into a skill, that raises it above the attribute. So, let's say we had a human with 3 die in dexterity. You give him plus 1 to blasters, 1 pip to blasters, and that becomes 3 die plus 1. If you assigned a full die, that would be 4 die to blasters. And that's how that worked. Simple, straightforward. Now, you could not raise your attributes after character creation. You could raise your skills. And here's how you raised your skills. You looked at the die of a skill. And that was how many XP it cost to raise it 1 pip. So if you had a skill that was 3 die, it would cost you 3 character points to raise it to 3 die plus 1. You want to raise it to 3 die plus 2, you would spend another 3. Then to raise it the 3rd time, to turn it to 4 die, you'd pay another 3 XP. A skill that was at 6 die plus 2, 6 character points. Again, simple, straightforward. Things got a little complicated with the Force. You see, Force points, your individual Force skills, when you were creating your character, you assigned those from your attribute dice. And then raising the Force skills took a little bit more XP. You see, to learn that first die of a Force skill cost 10 XP. So what this means is the 3 Force skills, Control, Sense, and Alter. You've spent an attribute point from your character attributes to get one of these, at least. Then you spend 10 XP to get that first rank in others once you're out of character creation. Now, with a teacher, you pay just the normal XP for raising a skill. If you don't have a teacher, you double that. And each full die you have in a force skill, you pick up a force power. And force powers range all over the place. Some are force jump, force push, those well-known things. Others are a whole variety that just were put together over the course of the years of this edition. Many of which worked their way into the expanded universe. Some were pulled from the old expanded universe, as many authors used the West End Games books as a sort of story guide and canon guide. But everything still pretty much worked out the same. And there you have it. The West End Games Star Wars system. Still one of my favorites. Although there were issues like force-sensitive characters could become extremely powerful compared to mundane characters just because of the flexibility of the force powers once they pick them up. And also the fact that there was no actual cap on how good you could get in anything, except how much XP you spent and could spend. But, beyond that, this was the solid foundation from which the rest of the Star Wars gaming universe would be developed. Next week, I will talk about the Wizards of the Coast games. So, until then, have fun and keep gaming.